Mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Kim Brown. I'm with the Montana Pre-Employment Transition Services Technical Assistance Center, and I'll be your moderator for today. This webinar is sponsored by the Montana Pre-Employment Transition Services Technical Assistance Center and is funded in whole or in part under a contract with the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services. The statements shared in today's presentation do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the department. All attendees are currently muted. If you want to ask the presenter a question or make a comment, please type your question or comment into the chat box. And please note that only you, myself, the moderator, and the presenter will be able to see what you've typed into the chat box. And so when our presenter lets us know that it's time for questions, I'll go ahead and read out whatever questions or comments you might have typed in, and then the presenter can answer those out loud. We will have probably a couple of question and answer periods during the presentation. It depends on how our presenter chooses to go about opening up the field for questions, so do be listening for that, but you're welcome to type in your questions at any time. For those of you who requested Montana Office of Public Instruction renewal units when you registered, those will be emailed to you after the webinar. Please note that it can take up to a couple of weeks to get the OPI renewal unit documentation sent out, and you do have to have pre-registered and noted on your pre-registration that you wanted to receive OPI credit in order for us to send that to you. Unfortunately, right now we're unable to issue other kinds of attendance documentation. Today's session is being audio taped for the PREETS Resource Library, and the recording for the webinar will be posted to the Montana Vocational Rehabilitation and Blind Services YouTube channel, and I will put the URL or website address for that YouTube channel into the chat box in just a bit. We'll get that posted as soon as possible. It can take up to a couple of weeks to get that recording online. Please note that the PowerPoint slides for today and several other resources are already available in the handouts section on your screen. If you can't see that right now, look up to the upper right-hand corner of your screen. There should be an orange box with a white arrow in it. If you click on that, it will open a dashboard, and part of that dashboard will be a handouts box. That's where you can find the slideshow for today, in addition to the other resources that our presenter has put up there to share with everyone. When we end the webinar today and you go to exit, a survey will pop up. Please do take the time to fill out that survey. It's only about 8 questions long, but we read through all of the responses that we receive, and we use those not only to try and improve the content and the quality and the technical pieces of what we're offering, but also to figure out what webinar topics you really want to learn about with respect to pre-employment transition services. So please do take the time to fill out that survey. And today we're trying a different time slot than we usually use. Today, for those of you in the Mountain Time Zone, we are meeting from 3:30 until 5, which is later in the day than we typically meet. So please also in your survey, if you think of it, let us know in the comment section whether this time slot works well for you or not so well, so that we can see if we want to keep doing some of these sessions at a later time. With that, I would like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. We are very lucky to have with us Ellen Condon. Ellen is the Director of the Pre-Employment Transition Services Technical Assistance Center and of the Transition and Employment Projects and of the Montana Deaf-Blind Project at the University of Montana's Rural Institute for Inclusive Communities. Thank you, Ellen, and with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. What we're going to be talking about is, getting some clarity on what competitive integrated employment is and what this means particularly for students. As Kim said, we are the PREETS Technical Assistance Center. We are on contract through Montana Vocational Rehabilitation and Blind Services to promote quality pre-employment transition services for students with disabilities in Montana. And so we provide technical assistance and support to schools and to vocational rehabilitation, and sometimes additionally to see the community rehab programs who are doing employment. So part of, or basically today, like what we'll be talking about is competitive integrated employment, mostly geared towards students. And so many of you are becoming familiar with the Work Innovation and Opportunity Act, which was just passed in 2014, and this has reauthorized the Rehabilitation Act. And basically one of the major components of WIOA is the expectation of competitive integrated employment for everybody. One of your handouts that's attached today is from the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, and a quote from their guidelines for students talks about competitive integrated employment being the gold standard for those students with disabilities and for people who want to work. So something that really is different with this reauthorization of the Rehab Act is that we have much higher standards for post-school outcomes for students with disabilities, and that means all students with disabilities. Our default position is kids are going to go to work, or students are going to go to work, and they're going to work in the community. And so part of our role as professionals, as teachers, as family members, is to help communicate that our expectations for all students with disabilities are different now. And part of what we're doing through the Pre-Employment Transition Services TAC is helping schools see how they can best support students to be prepared for competitive integrated employment, and how students and families can start to envision that for their young person. So basically, what is the definition of competitive integrated employment? The biggest piece is that it's inclusive. It's in the community. It's alongside people without disabilities. It's at a location where the job seeker, the employee with the disability, interacts with other people who don't have disabilities, and to the same extent that someone in a comparable position interacts with other folks. So, to explain what that means, say somebody's running a lawn care business or working on a lawn care business, you would compare that person's interaction with people without disabilities to anybody else working in a similar position. The other significant piece of competitive integrated employment is that people are paid at minimum or prevailing wage, and whichever is higher, state or federal. Self-employment can be considered competitive integrated employment, and it's actually okay initially if the person isn't bringing in minimum wage to start, because it's recognized that many times when you start a business, it takes you a while to build up your customer base and your market. The other significant piece of competitive integrated employment is that there's opportunities for advancement within your job. So what WIOA is saying is that this is our expectation for all students. This is what we would like to see as the post-school outcome for students with learning disabilities, for students with significant intellectual disabilities and multiple disabilities. And so what does that look like, and what does that mean? I picked out these two photos from the internet to kind of contrast what WIOA means versus what we've thought previously were okay post-school outcomes for people with more significant disabilities. So the young man on the left, working at a desk in an agency, is our example of competitive integrated employment. He's working alongside other people without disabilities. I'm presuming he's getting minimum wage or above, and he's gone directly from school into paid community employment. And ideally, from what you're going to learn this afternoon, is that ideally he's going to have that job before he leaves high school. There's not going to be a point in time where he's in limbo between school and work. In contrast, on the right is a picture of a traditional sheltered workshop where people with disabilities are all in the same building together. Typically, the only people in that building without disabilities are people who are the staff. And to earn money, people with disabilities typically are paid what's called piece rate. And so what they earn per hour depends on how many pieces of a product they produce. And so part of the significance of WIOA is that there are major restrictions against students, young people, moving from school into sub-minimum wage providers. And so the sheltered workshops traditionally have paid less than minimum wage and piece rate. And so with WIOA, we're really looking at how do we use pre-employment transition services to make sure that we prepare all of our students in our classrooms for work in the community at prevailing wage or better. And so students no longer are going to move directly to sheltered workshops. There's going to be a lot more chance for them to experience real work for real wages in the community before they may choose that. And in some states, I just got back from Washington very early this morning, in some states like Washington State, people can no longer enter their sheltered workshops. Those front doors are theoretically closed. So by 2019, all of their sheltered workshops will be gone. WIOA doesn't mandate that, but it just restricts the use of sub-minimum wage. So what's the rationale about this competitive integrated employment piece? Basically, we've known, or there's been research that's shown for years that people with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities have the highest unemployment rates of all people with disabilities. In 2013, a report by Department of Labor stated that only 26% of students with disabilities, and that's all disabilities, are employed after high school. So that's 26% in contrast to 64% of their non-disabled peers. The other piece is that the unemployment rates of people receiving public mental health services are 3 times that of the general population. So in Montana, as we're looking at who's eligible for pre-employment transition services, we're talking about students who have IEPs, we're talking about students on 504 plans, and we're also talking about people who are potentially eligible for voc rehab. So that may be some of our folks who are receiving mental health services as students who may become this large population of folks who are unemployed as adults. It's also been shown that people thought to be unemployable, if we give them the opportunity and the support to work, can be productive members of society. They can work for minimum or prevailing wage and achieve independence. The other piece that we know, and the other rationale for focusing on increasing competitive integrated employment, is that of the 30 million people with disabilities, 27% of them live in poverty. So over a quarter of all people with disabilities are living in poverty. So the hope is that by starting earlier and working collaboratively with voc rehab and with schools, students will be better prepared to enter the workforce, and will enter the workforce right out of high school. So in addition to the mandates that came out of WIOA and the reauthorization of the Rehab Act, it was also stated that an advisory committee had to be formed. And one of your handouts is the final report from the Advisory Committee on Increasing Competitive Integrated Employment for Individuals with Disabilities. This committee met for close to 2 years. They just put their summary report together in September. It's a really big report, but it's got really nice sections within it. So you can say, I really want to know what they're recommending for IDEA reauthorization, meaning when the law that guides what happens for special ed in schools comes up for reauthorization. I'm really curious to hear what they recommended there. There's a section on that. There's a section on adult providers and transformation of segregated services towards integrated services. And there's a whole section on youth and students. So I recommend that you look at the publication because it's really good, but you can take it in chunks and it doesn't look so overwhelming. But basically what their role was to identify ways to increase employment for individuals with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities and other significant disabilities through opportunities for competitive integrated employment. And they also examine the use of subminimum wage certificates, which are what 14C is. It's the 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act that enabled employers to pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage based on their production. And it's a pretty archaic regulation that many people are now challenging, saying that if instead of promoting people based on what they can't do, we look at their contributions and what they can do and market them to employers that way, then we don't really need to use the subminimum wage as an incentive for employers to hire. So part of the advisory committee's final report is that there's, again, there's been really poor employment outcomes. We have focused on transition since 1980s with big federal funds going out to states. And still, students are exiting high school without jobs, without the expectation of employment. States are still putting quite a bit of their resources into sheltered settings instead of competitive integrated employment settings. And people are still poor. People with disabilities are still poor. And so they identified 5 critical reasons, one of which is the limited access to work experience while students are in high school. And so, I've worked in schools around Montana and around the country, and there's varying degrees of access to work experience. Sometimes people only get access to work experience in their high school. Sometimes maybe they only get one opportunity out in the community. Sometimes people don't get an individualized experience, but they just get to rotate through some work sites that are already established that all kids with disabilities rotate through. There's a very wide realm. What you're going to find is that the data is showing us that if people have an individualized paid job, not just experience, but a job, a real job where they're hired and paid by that employer, before they exit school, they are far more likely to work as an adult in the community. The next piece is the disjointed service delivery. And what that means is that, until we had the reauthorization of the Rehab Act, Voc Rehab and schools weren't able to really work in tandem and as partners. We were able, part of IDEA legislation says to the schools, with parent permission, you need to invite outside agencies into this IEP who may be able to pay for services or provide services to students during transition and after. But we haven't all worked in tandem. And so what the research also is saying is that if folks work as partners, possibly co-supporting, co-funding, or using braided or blended funding, meaning you either, various entities like VR, DD, and the school fund pieces of the person's transition and work at the same time, those situations are leading to much higher success rates of paid employment for students after they exit. The other one that's coming up loud and clear is that people who need assistive technology have challenges accessing it when necessary. So accessing it in school to know what they could do for job tasks, accessing the technology that they might need as an adult, and then also finding funding sources that enables them to own that technology as a student and have it remain with them as they go to work as an adult. The fourth area was uneven access to information by families. So, when you think about, working and living in Montana, we've got some main communities, and then we have a lot of rural communities. And when we were at the transition conference a couple of weeks ago in Helena, there were teachers up in rural areas saying, we never knew that access to developmental disability services in Montana had a waiting list, or that the waiting list changed in the past 5 years. How are we supposed to get this information to families? Also, do all schools have information? This year we are trying so hard through the PREET's Employment Services TAC and through Voc Rehab to get out to every single school to talk to them about the availability of a contract with DPHHS, Department of Health and Human Services, to provide pre-employment transition services and to access money in order to do so. But still, some schools don't have that information as clearly as other schools. So when schools and providers don't have all the information, families don't have all the information. So that's another area that leads to less successful transition outcomes for students with disabilities. The final piece that the advisory committee identified is that there's a lack of staff training around competitive integrated employment strategies. So strategies that would enable their students with significant needs to participate in quality work experiences and obtain community employment. So one of the questions I'm going to ask you at the end of the webinar is, what can the PREET's Technical Assistance Center staff provide in terms of training, in terms of structure, in terms of support to help schools and families envision the possibility of employment for all students with disabilities? And also, how do we help the schools build capacity around looking at students as employable and creating quality work experiences for them? So again, if we look at factors that are indicative of successful post-school outcomes for students with disabilities, there's various, it's not just having work experience while you're in high school, but it's having work experiences throughout high school. So, some schools that I've had the great opportunity to work in the past, students have a different work experience each quarter of the school year, and it starts freshman year and goes all throughout high school, and they're all community-based experiences. The earlier we start in high school, and there's no reason you can't start in middle school or start talking to families about starting work and chores and just the expectation of work very early in life. But we've got to begin early in high school, and we've got to begin looking at all different types of jobs and careers rather than just some of our traditional cleaning or stocking. We've got to look at technology. We've got to look at health careers. We've got to look at agriculture careers. there's a lot more than what we traditionally look at. But we've also got to make sure that we're looking at integrated paid work before high school exit. And I'm going to give you a lot more information on what's integrated, what's not, from the integration mandate from around the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is also one of your handouts. Another factor that's predicting successful employment, community employment after high school for students with disabilities is that their family expects that their child will work. So, first of all, that's got to be an awareness that their child can work. If there's fears around a child going to work, that's got to be something that we somehow support the family to work through. If people are unclear about how going to work impacts somebody's Social Security and Medicaid, we have a lot of resources in our state through the independent living centers and some other private benefits planners where those services and that information can be developed for that individual and their family so they know what they can make, what they can save, and that actually they can earn quite a bit of money before they might impact their Medicaid. The other piece that's correlated highly with successful post-school employment is that families are supported to navigate the various funding streams. And so if the funding streams are all working together on behalf of a person before somebody exits, that's going to provide a much easier transition directly into employment. So the research is showing that where communities and schools and agencies, communities where schools and agencies are working together and collaboratively funding and supporting employment for students while they're still in school have a much higher employment outcome rate. Because remember, the initial rates that I talked about is that the Department of Labor found that only 26% of students with disabilities, all disabilities, are employed after high school. What they're finding in communities where voc rehab, developmental disabilities, and schools all work together, they're finding that the employment rates at exit are 60 to 70%. I just had the great opportunity to work in King County, Washington, and those are the rates that they've been getting for students with developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities with their School to Work partnership project. And basically that's where the schools have an employment consultant from a community rehab program in their school, or work assigned to their school, assigned to their students with disabilities, with developmental disabilities. And by working together with DD, the schools, and VR, they are getting up to 68% success rate. So, and that's just folks with developmental disabilities. We also want to make sure that we're including folks with mental health support needs, mental health issues, and also looking at bringing workforce to the table. So we now can work together better with the collaborative mandate through WIOA. So we should start expecting our outcomes of paid employment upon exit to be a whole lot higher. And so I tried to come up with some examples, but part of what we're doing through the PREITS Employment Transition Center, Technical Assistance Center, we're actually looking for examples to highlight in Montana so that we can showcase these examples in our PREIT showcase and share those through the listserv with schools around the state. And I know there's some of you on this conference call that are from out of state. You guys are also welcome to be on our electronic listserv and can get those stories as well. But in 2000, we had a transition demonstration grant where we did very individualized employment experience and assessment for students with significant disabilities, and those students got to have one work experience each quarter. And so there's a young man on our Consumer Advisory Council who worked at 2 different video stores. He worked at St. Joseph's Hospital where, you know, in the nursing home. Other people worked with in the cafeteria, in medical records. So we had a partnership with St. Joseph Hospital to provide internship sites. At that time, these were unpaid internship sites, and we followed the guidelines around Department of Labor regulations for unpaid work experiences. And then as soon as somebody was starting to contribute and it was no longer a learning experience, they either changed work sites or in some cases they got hired by that employer. But in 2000 to 2004, the school was a partner. Voc Rehab was providing funding at exit, and what we know now is that Voc Rehab now can provide support to students as early as age 14 through individual case services, and in our state, Voc Rehab is providing schools funding. So Voc Rehab is a very good partner right now, federally. So we use Social Security work incentives, and we use local employers. In 2006 and 2007, we worked in Hamilton Middle School identifying nonprofits in the community and set up work experience sites at nonprofits for all the middle school kids. And they went in small groups and they were able to disperse once they got into the employment setting. But I think many of those sites are still being used. I know Whitefish High School right now and Hamilton High School are both working collaboratively with several of the community rehab programs to place students in paid job experiences and paid jobs before high school exit. So I know there's more of you out there. I'm sorry that I didn't get you on this slide, but we would love to hear from you because we would love to showcase what you're doing.
Ellen, before you continue on, there's a question, a clarification that came in, and I'm wondering if you're willing to answer that real quickly.
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm hearing references to people with developmental disabilities and people receiving mental health services. Are you including people with intellectual disabilities?
Yes. Yes, actually, I thought I was stating developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities, but yes, thank you for letting me know I wasn't that clear. So yes, we're definitely talking about, I think as we start talking about raising the bar, we're definitely talking about people with the most significant disabilities and making sure they're included. So we're definitely talking about intellectual disabilities as well.
Thank you.
Is that the only question right now?
That is, thanks.
Okay. So as you're looking at what pre-employment transition services are, one of the documents that we've created recently as the TAC team is the Pre-Employment Transition Services Guide for Schools. And so we call it the pie chart document because that's on the front of the document. But it has the federal definitions of the 5 pre-ETS categories, examples of what could be provided as an activity within that category, and allowable expenses. The allowable expenses are specific, maybe specific to Montana. So if you're from outside of Montana, some of the examples may not work because these are ways that schools can spend their pre-ETS money. So when you're looking at all of our schools, in order to access the funding from Voc Rehab, you have to put together a work plan. And the work plan contains activities in all the 5 areas of pre-ETS, so job exploration counseling, work-based learning experiences, counseling for post-secondary education, workplace readiness training, and instruction in self-advocacy. So each school needs to put together, or each school district needs to put together a work plan of activities they're going to offer in the 5 areas. As you're doing that, keep in mind that the purpose of PREETS, the pre-employment transition services, is to ultimately increase competitive integrated employment. So we want to make sure that as you're talking about work-based learning experiences, students are having individualized paid activities in the community. They need to have community-based experiences and paid work in order to promote the post-school outcome of paid community employment. So as you're trying to determine what you do for your work plan and how you use your resources, keep in mind what our end goal is. So again, WIOA really raises the expectation of what students with significant disabilities could do. It really promotes the awareness that there's strategies out there that are very individualized, that focus on how do we get to know a student in terms of what they're good at, what kind of supports they need to be successful, and how do we negotiate positions that enable them to be successful and employed in the community. The other piece that we need to keep doing is engaging families. How do we ensure families understand the civil right and the access to community employment and the importance for their son or daughter of being a community member and their right to access community employment? And part of what we do as the Technical Assistance Center is respond to requests for information and needs. So if somebody has an idea or an identified need in a community around how to support families to think differently about employing their son or daughter, let us know. Send us an email, add it to your survey at the end of this webinar. But that's part of what we do through the Technical Assistance Center, is we create resources that schools and families and VR can use. So what we do is in response to what you say you need. So when we think about students with intellectual disabilities, multiple disabilities, students who are going to be tricky to get employed, not unemployable, but they're not going to be able to go out and just apply for a job and that will be their first job. What we want to recognize is that as we typically talk about job exploration counseling and workplace readiness, we talk about teaching people how to identify job openings, how to dress for interviews, how to prepare for interviews, how to fill out job applications. But what we want to point out is that there's a large population of students who don't compete well. Maybe they can't do everything in the job description. Maybe when they're held up against other job applicants, even if it's all students with disabilities, they're not going to be the one chosen because they only have use of their head or one arm. And so when you look at potential production, that's not, they're just not going to produce as much. So we need a different strategy for the folks that don't compete well. So as you're writing your work plans or as we're out working with our schools, let's look to make sure that we're looking at job exploration counseling strategies that introduce the opportunity for negotiated employment, not just going and competing for jobs. It's great for people to have experience interviewing and dressing nicely for work, But let's also add in, you know, you may want to list all the employers that you're connected to in your community. Because if you think about how many of us got jobs, we got them through connections. Let's teach students to go out and ask a business what kind of things they need from employees. Let's teach teachers to go out to businesses and help identify unmet needs. And let's work with students to identify what they're good at, but also what types of environments and what types of supports enable them to be most contributing, and what skills and what tasks could those students offer to an employer that they would do for pay. And let's do that in addition to some of the traditional things that we offer through job exploration counseling. So customized employment is a term that if you've been on our listservs for a while, you've been hearing us talk about for years, but it's now written into the Rehab Act as a strategy that people can use to get competitive integrated employment. And so customized employment is basically an individualized relationship that reflects the skills, the needs, the contributions of the employee or the job seeker, and also reflects the unmet needs of the employer. It's got to be a win-win for both parties, otherwise it's not employment. And so if we're going to go out and customize a job for a student, we've got to get to know the student pretty well. We're going to need to know what their skills and tasks and contributions are. We're going to go to employers that may have unmet needs that they can meet, and where there might be a good match for them. And typically, the job seeker is represented by a job developer who presents a proposal on their behalf, and the resulting position is negotiated. That's different from the traditional way to get a job. It doesn't mean it's better, it just means it's different. And so as we're putting together workplace readiness training and instruction in self-advocacy, let's incorporate some of these skills and activities into those categories to make sure that we're really preparing all of our students for competitive integrated employment. So in customized job development, we don't typically go looking for job openings. We actually go and get to know a business, look at what they need, what's not getting done, and how our particular job seeker is able to offer tasks to them in order to boost their bottom line. And so it's a very different job development strategy. How we get there is by using strategies that are different from some of our traditional assessment strategies. And at the Rural Institute, we still get quite a few questions about, we've got a student with really significant disabilities. What do we use for age-appropriate transition assessments? If we use something, a checklist that identifies everything they can or can't do, or can do independently or with help, or not at all, students with significant disabilities are going to come up way short on those assessments. If I'm expected to develop competitive integrated employment for that student, that type of assessment isn't going to assist me to get there. Instead, I need to look at assessments that really gather information from people who know that student well about how they actually do things. How do they get from one point to the other? What strategies have families figured out for a student with blindness or mobility issues? For somebody who doesn't have verbal communication, how did they get their point across? How can I use that on a job site? How can I build tasks around what the person can do or what they have for technology? Those are the types of assessments we're going to need to start incorporating throughout age-appropriate transition assessments, throughout our pre-ET services, and throughout transition in general in order for us to look at competitive integrated employment for everybody. And then there may seem to be a little disconnect here. WIOA is telling us that we need to expect competitive integrated employment for all students and not to assume that we're going to direct people into sheltered settings. WIOA directs us to assume that people can go to work if we use effective strategies. Under IDEA, which is the school legislation around transition, there isn't that strong a directive. However, many of us in the field are hoping to see that down the road. So your least dangerous position is to start with setting the bar high. Looking at how we get to know enough about a student to match the work experience to who they are and where they'll be successful so that we can learn more about their abilities and contributions. And ideally, we're going to offer students an evolution of work experiences that lets us and them and their families continue to see them as employable, and we can build on their skills and build on our information of them so that we do have a paid community employment job for them as they exit, and that they're already in it before. So we can weave some of these strategies of discovery into VR assessments, age-appropriate transition assessments. We'd love to start working with schools around how do we infuse discovery, that process of getting to know who the student is through an informal process, into day-to-day activities, into your classes, into your work experiences. And how do we continue to engage and empower and involve families? So the main impact that WIOA has brought to services is that there's a mandated collaboration between education and voc rehab. Voc rehab can start with students as early as age 14. 15% of voc rehab nationally of their budget needs to be spent on students with disabilities through the 5 mandated categories and other authorized categories. The preferred outcome of pre-employment transition services is competitive integrated employment, so community employment. Customized employment and supported employment are strategies that some students may need to achieve competitive integrated employment. So the other piece, the other resource that I want to bring in a little bit here at the end is the statement from the Department of Justice on the U.S. Department of Justice on the application of the integration mandate of Title II of the ADA. And basically, Department of Justice has just produced this white paper that gives us quite a bit of guidance around the need, and also the Civil Rights Act, where people with disabilities need access to inclusive settings. And so as we're thinking about the integrated and competitive integrated employment, this helps us see what kind of things are integrated, what kind of pre-ETS activities would be considered getting people ready for community employment, because they're finding when we look at numbers across the country, there's still way too many people with disabilities entering segregated settings or at risk of entering segregated employment settings. So that might be sheltered work, it might be day programs, it might be institutions, unfortunately. So in this article, they talk about the role of education as offering timely and adequate transition services designed to allow students to understand and experience the benefits of work in an integrated setting. So as you're thinking about how you use your pre-ETS resources and the activities and capacity you build within your school, keep in mind that the end goal is competitive integrated employment. How do we ensure that all of our students are getting access to an experience in the community? So a school, and this is a quote out of the article from Department of Justice, a school may be seen as putting students at risk of institutionalization and segregation if they are training students in tasks similar to those performed in a sheltered workshop, or if they're encouraging students to participate in sheltered workshops as part of their transition services, and or if they're routinely referring students to sheltered workshops as the post-secondary placement without offering students opportunities to experience employment in the community. There was a Department of Justice went into the state of Rhode Island a few years ago, and they investigated a school that as part of their transition process had quite a few students with intellectual and developmental disabilities working on tasks that prepared them for the local sheltered workshop. And upon graduation, those students just directly went into the sheltered workshop. That was their path to post-secondary education. They were found out of compliance with the ADA because they were putting students unnecessarily at risk and not offering people informed choice. The state of Oregon recently settled, I think 2 years ago, with the U.S. Department of Justice. And again, what the ruling was about was that people were unnecessarily segregated in sheltered workshops, and this is part of why now we're seeing in the law under WIOA Section 511 is that we need to make sure that people have the opportunity to try out community employment so they can make an informed choice if sheltered work is what they're choosing, and that they also know that there are strategies that will enable them to be successful in community employment, and that folks who are in sheltered workshops get the opportunity for information about having a choice and what could be out there in the community if they want to pursue it. And in the state of Montana, the independent living centers will be working on Section 511 and going out and speaking with people who currently work in sheltered settings, ones that have a 14C certificate, and interviewing them and offering them information. So the integration mandate basically states that public entities are required to administer services, programs, and activities in the most integrated setting appropriate. So that means schools, that means developmental disability programs, that means voc rehab, that means, I guess, our state colleges as well, public entities. The most integrated setting is a setting that enables people with disabilities to interact with non-disabled persons to the fullest extent possible. And competitive integrated employment is at a location where the employee interacts with individuals without disabilities and has access to the same opportunities for advancement and for benefits that are provided to other people without disabilities. And again, the Department of Justice guidance on integration is one of your attachments. So in contrast, a segregated setting also includes settings that are managed, operated, or licensed by a service provider to serve primarily people with disabilities, or those workers who are exclusively or primary individuals with disabilities who are supervised and supported by staff. Employment services provided to a person in a sheltered workshop or to a group of employees with disabilities who routinely work in isolation from non-disabled peers, whether that be in a large sheltered building, whether that be on a farm, whether that be inside another public business. If it's a group of people with disabilities who routinely work in isolation from the non-disabled peers, it's segregated. And so we need to keep going back to what is the primary goal of pre-employment transition services, and questioning, are we getting our kids ready for competitive integrated work? And making sure that we're offering experience in community integrated employment. So here are 3 of the resources. The WINTAC is an organization that's funded federally, and they're one of the federal TACs that provide assistance and technical assistance to Montana as well as many other states. They have a great website. The advisory committee report is there. The DOJ report is there. And so I would love to hear from you. I don't have a clock because I turned off my phone, but so if we have time now, you know, if people out there have thoughts about how schools can use their pre-ETS funding to increase competitive and integrated employment for students, or if you have questions about that. And the other piece is, how can the pre-ETS Technical Assistance Center help? What kind of training, what kind of guidance, what kind of resources can we find or create for you?
So Ellen, we're actually really good for time. We have about 34 minutes, and we do have a number of questions that have come in. If you'd like me to start with those.
That sounds great.
Okay, so the first one actually came in quite a while ago in your presentation. How many hours on average are the 68% of working folks working per week, and what do they do in the other hours of the week?
I think that's going to depend on where the data is coming from. In the King County project, I don't have that specific information, but developmental disability services in Washington State for employment, basically they've committed that those services go towards employment. I think they do have some community access, but it's supposed to be integrated and lead to employment. But I think people aren't necessarily guaranteed like supervision for 20 or 40 hours a week. They're getting access to employment service. So that would be something we'd have to look up, and I'm sure it's going to be different state by state. And I would guess that there's states out there that would self-admit that maybe there's too few hours that people are working. But when we look at customized employment for people with more significant needs, that doesn't necessarily mean that people will work fewer hours. It just means that if they do need to work fewer hours than 20 a week, you would start there with them.
Okay, thank you. The next question, do you have advice on approaching schools to provide more career cruising and helping with work experiences while in high school?
I don't know what, I've heard the term career cruising for the first time today, but I think Voc Rehab in Montana is contracting with schools, and part of the responsibility of the school is to provide activities in those 5 areas, one of which is work-based learning experiences. And so we're expecting to see more of that in Montana schools. I'm not sure that all Montana schools want to or have the capacity to offer that themselves, but I know there's several schools right now looking to subcontract with employment agencies who would provide that service for their students. The other piece is that if we have students with more significant needs, those students can be referred to vocational rehabilitation as early as age 14 and get additional support for work experience. So I think that's the expectation now. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, and I envision people needing help to figure that out. So I'm hoping that that's where we get to provide some assistance in terms of setting up different models that schools can use, but also providing some technical assistance where that's needed.
And this next question ties into that a bit. Are the schools aware of WIOA and that they are responsible for taking on some old voc rehab services?
I would assume that in Montana they are. Like, our goal is to meet with every single school in the state this year to share information about these expectations and to offer PREETS funding. I would guess the level of understanding may differ, but I think there's a lot of resources out there through voc rehab and through the TAC and other entities. So if schools aren't aware, there should be a lot of help to get them aware. And maybe, and I would guess there's also different levels of understanding of WIOA and the impact.
Okay. How does customized employment ensure that the student is making a minimum wage?
Oh, good question. Basically, customized employment doesn't allow anything under minimum wage. That's part of the definition. And in part of the strategy that helps with that is that when you go negotiate a job for somebody, you're not comparing them to existing personnel. For instance, if this is a person who just has, like, their pace tends to be methodical, it takes them longer to do things than other people, I wouldn't be looking at tasks that emphasize high production. I'd be looking at tasks for them within an employer that emphasize meticulousness and quality control. And so as I would represent the person, I'm looking at, these are tasks that you typically pay somebody at whatever rate, and so I'm looking for that same salary for this individual. And so it may be above minimum wage when you start that negotiation. But I think the job development strategies are a little bit different. Actually, they're a lot different in customized employment. But yeah, it's not allowed. You can't pay sub-minimum wage in customized. I know that was something that we did historically in supported employment occasionally. But if it's customized, it can't be lower than minimum wage.
Okay. The next question, what support staff goes with the student on work experiences, and do those work experiences occur during the school day?
That's our favorite answer. It depends. So it totally depends. It depends on what that student's class schedule looks like, what their graduation requirements are. It depends on the staffing in the school. You know, pre-employment transition services can happen during the school day, they can happen after school, they can happen in the summer, they can happen on weekends. It's totally going to depend, and I would guess that there's probably examples of everything you could think of.
Okay.
Can I add one more piece?
Oh, sure. Sorry.
In Montana, no, I just thought of it after I answered the question. In Montana, we've divided, the Technical Assistance Center staff has divided up the state. So there is a geographic lead in every part of our state. And so if you're struggling with something at your school, you are so welcome to contact us or contact the VR counselor supervisor. And as long as the TAC exists, we're funded through vocational rehabilitation, and so we're available at no cost to the school. That's our job. So, you know, feel free to reach out to us. And if you don't know who your geographic lead is, you can reach out to your VR counselor supervisor or send Kim or I an email or check the PREETS Technical Assistance Center part of the DPHHS transition website. because it's all there.
Okay, great. And we have, I wish I could unmute you, Pam, because we have some great comments from Pam with the Montana Career Information Services. And Pam has explained that career cruising is a paid version of what MCIS offers for free. And so Pam says that many schools use the free MCIS version rather than paid career cruising. And let me just scroll down to some of the other comments. MCIS, or the Montana Career Information Services, establishes a portfolio for life, so students can use that after school to create resumes, research occupations, etc. And so thank you for sharing that information, Pam. Appreciate that. Pam did present on a webinar for us the last go-around, and we have that recorded and archived. So if you'd like to learn more about Montana Career Information Services or system, you can take a look at that archived webinar. Next question. What's being done to ensure that students are not being put at risk of sheltered employment? When you described how schools need to make sure that they aren't setting up students for sheltered employment, is anything being done in Montana to make sure students aren't being put at risk?
I think that's part of the role of those of us who are reviewing the work plans submitted by each school, is that the expectation of the pre-ETS resources and activities are that it's geared towards competitive integrated employment.
Is there anything more that can be done in Montana to enhance the coordination between VR, schools, DD, and providers, similar to what you described in King County?
I think part of what Voc Rehab is doing is that anytime there's information around pre-ETS, it's being shared with Montana DD. I think our focus currently has been spending most of our hours on connecting with schools and helping with work plans and getting the contracts in place. I think we probably also need to do some outreach to developmental disabilities case managers about WIOA and expectations, and see how there are ways to come to the table together. In King County, the county developmental disabilities system invests, they were saying 80% of their budget is invested in school to work. And school to work is all focused on community employment. So I think that they've been doing it for quite a while, and they're very clear what their priorities are, and that we just aren't there yet. But if anybody has other ideas, I think Voc Rehab as well as the TAC would love to hear that, because it would be great to have all of us working together.
Is the Technical Assistance Center and/or VR working with the Office of Public Instruction to contact both public and private schools about the things you've discussed today?
Yes, we are. Frank Podovnik and Dick Treerice they were part of our all-staff meeting at VR. We have had several meetings with them about pre-employment transition services, and the schools that are eligible for contracts have to be, I'm trying to think of the language. If anybody from VR is on, they can feel free to help me, but they have to be like overseen by OPI and provide IDEA services. So some of the Catholic schools do qualify. Some of the private schools do, like Pine Hills does in Miles City. So I know not all of the private schools do, but if you have a question about that, about whether or not your particular school would qualify for PREATS funding, let us know. But all the students, as long as the students have an IEP, 504 plan, or are potentially eligible for VOC Rehab, they would be eligible for individual services through VOC Rehab. So we have at least 4 presentations at the CEC conference coming up. So we're trying to get the word out.
Okay, next question. For those consumers that need one-on-one supervision in order to be safe in the community, how much time could VR realistically provide them weekly for employment services? I currently have a consumer that has been told they can have 1 hour a week total, which leaves them at home alone a large portion of the time. Where do we get money to provide further staffing for this person?
I think you would need to speak with your VR office about what's available for that individual. And I know our state right now is in order of selection, which means that VOC Rehab they have to place some people who are eligible for VOC Rehab services on the wait list, but right now the top priority is people with significant disabilities, or the most significant disabilities, so people who have several disability categories. So I would speak directly to your VR counselor. I would also look at work incentives. If this person has developmental disabilities funding, look at, speak to their case manager to see if there's any way to expand their current budget.
Were you finished with that one? Sorry, I didn't want to jump in.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, no, I'm done.
Okay. Next question. Where can we find additional strategies for approaching employers for customizable employment opportunities? Employers are very busy, and we need to have a professional, concise presentation prepared when we're actually able to meet with them.
Actually, I would say that would be your customized job development training. We have a wonderful article that's, I believe it's on our website. Kim, tell me if I'm truthful here.
Yes.
But about negotiated employment, that's written by Mike Callahan. That's fabulous. And then there should be another one by Carrie Griffin about big sign syndrome, which is also a great article. But Chanda Hermanson Dudley and I have been starting conversations about how to build provider capacity in the state by bringing in some training, and so we're looking for funding to be able to offer that to providers so that providers don't have to pay the huge costs themselves.
Any other questions out there or comments that you would like to share with Ellen today? While people are typing, Ellen, there is a comment that the handouts you provided were great. So if folks haven't had a chance to download those, you might want to do that before the webinar ends today. They are excellent resources, and Ellen referenced them during the presentation. Looks like no other questions. If you have final comments before my final comments, Ellen.
I'm good. Yeah, we are curious to hear if people did like this time. So thank you very much for attending.
Okay, and just a couple of final comments. A reminder that the short survey will appear on your screen as soon as the webinar ends. Please do fill that out. Our next webinar that we'll be offering is one sponsored by Children's Special Health Services, and that will address inclusion. That will take place on January 24th, 2017, and we will have information about that out probably in about three weeks or so. The next Pre-Employment Transition Services webinar will be held on February 9th, 2017, and the topic for that is yet to be determined. So if there are topics that you are really interested in related to pre-employment transition services, please include those on your survey. We also wanted to mention that there is an Office of Disability Employment Policy Community of Practice webinar taking place on December 14th. The topic is application of the integration mandate of Title II of the ADA and Olmstead v. LC to state and local governments' employment service systems for individuals with disabilities. That was a mouthful. Ellen, did you want to mention anything about that webinar?
Only that one of the presenters is an attorney with the Department of Justice, and so I would guess they will be speaking about the lawsuit in Oregon. I'm just guessing, but I'm thinking it's going to be a good presentation. So usually they archive them if you can't get to the live session.
And again, that's taking place on December 14th, and we will be sending out a notice about that webinar and a number of other training opportunities coming up to all of the listserv members. So if you're not yet a member of the Pre-Employment Transition Services listserv, hopefully when you registered for today's webinar, you mentioned on your registration form that you would like to join the listserv, and we'll go ahead and get you added, and then you'll receive the notice about that webinar. A reminder that the recording for today's session will be posted to the Voc Rehab and Blind Services YouTube channel, and if you look in the handouts section or the chat section of your webinar dashboard, you should see the URL or website address for that YouTube channel, and it can take up to a couple of weeks for those to be posted. We did have a few more questions come in. Ellen, do you want to respond to those now, or do you want me to send those to you via email?
We've got time. Go ahead.
Okay. So the first one is, who is responsible for approaching the employers about work experiences and competitive integrated employment?
That's going to depend on how your school or how your community is doing it. I know I think in Hamilton High School, they hired a job developer. In other schools, I know Helena schools are looking to subcontract with an employment vendor. It just depends on what you work out in your school. If the person is on Voc Rehab's caseload for individual services, then Voc Rehab will subcontract with somebody, a community rehab provider.
Okay. For those individuals who choose not to be employed, will they still be able to go into day programs or a combo day program and employment situation?
For people 24 and under, they cannot go directly into a 14C provider, and this is something that will be monitored by Department of Labor, not by Voc Rehab, unless they have met specific requirements, one being they participated in pre-employment transition services, they applied for and were in a plan with Voc Rehab for employment services, and they've tried competitive integrated employment. Those people over age 24, I believe they can go directly into a segregated setting. And I would need to get clarification around day activity, going directly into day activity, but I believe we need to offer competitive integrated employment to everybody.
Okay. And that looks like all of the questions. For now, there is one that I will email to you after the webinar, Ellen, because it's specific to a certain location.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Ellen, for your fabulous presentation today. Thanks to all of the audience members for your great questions and comments, and for joining us this afternoon and sticking with us to the end of your workday. And we will be getting out information about the upcoming webinars to the listserv members. So if you haven't joined, be sure and let us know that you would like to do so. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.